Arrays are collections of objects of the same data type in PHP, Java, and C++. You might think of an array as something like a pillbox. That is, a box separated into compartments of the same size, holding objects of the same data type. In PHP, the declaration and initialization of an array are often performed in the same step using the array method. Here we have two examples. The first example is an array of strings. The array's name is Pony_name, and notice the square brackets after the name. We use the function array to designate or set up the elements in the array. In this case, it's an array of strings, so Rainbow Dash, Starlight, and Moondancer are the strings that would be stored within that array. They would be indexed or receive a subscript value of 0, 1, and 2. So to access Rainbow Dash, it would be Pony_name 0. To access Starlight, it would be Pony_name 1. To access Moondancer, it would be Pony_name 2. The next example is an array of integers. And again, the array is named PonyAges. Notice the square brackets after the name, using the array method to set up the elements. And in this case, we're storing the integers 2, 4, and 3 inside the array. Now let's review this. By default, arrays are indexed from 0 to the last element. This means that the default subscript value of the first element is always 0. If we were going to explicitly assign values to an array after its creation, we could do so by using the array's subscript or index value. So again, to access the different strings stored in the array, we would simply use the index or subscript value. You can modify the default index or subscript value that each array element receives using equals and the greater than symbol like so. We have our array Pony_name. We're using the array method, but this time, instead of starting with the default subscript value of 0, we're making Rainbow Dash to be indexed as 7. Starlight as 8, and Moondancer as 9. Again, in the example above, Rainbow Dash now starts at index 7, Starlight is at index 8, and Moondancer is at index 9 because we use the arrow or the equals and greater than sign. You may also create an array that uses a string rather than an integer to identify the index value of its elements. The string and element combination become a keyed pair in the array. If you do this, remember that you can no longer access the array by an integer subscript, but must instead use the array element string identifier. Look at the following examples. We have an array, but instead of being indexed as 0, 1, and 2 for a subscript value, we have string values of name1, name2, and name3. To set such an array up, you could do this. Create the array with the square brackets, use the array method, but in this example, use string key values and pair them with the values stored in the array. Therefore, the elements will be identified by name1, name2, name3 instead of 0, 1, 2. Let's review. To access an element in an array, you simply use the index value of the element you wish to access. For example, I'm going to use the echo statement, and I'm going to say Pony_name1. Well, I would access it by using the array name Pony_names and the subscript value of the first element in the array, which would be 0, inside the square brackets. Now on the other hand, if my array, instead of using integers, used a string key pair as the subscript value, then I would access it via that string's name, so nam1. Array objects become truly powerful and versatile when they are combined with loop and repetition structures. When doing so, a special method available to array objects is often used, the count method. The count function can automatically determine the number of elements in an array. For example, in the following bit of code we have a basic for loop, and we're using the count method to determine how many elements are in the array Pony_names. Now, if we knew how many elements were stored in the array, we could simply hard code the value, in this case 3. But what if we don't know how many elements are in the array? The count method allows us to code something dynamically, so even when we don't know how many elements are in the array, we can automatically retrieve the number of objects stored in the array. In this case, we will iterate through the for loop as many times or as many elements are stored in the array, and we'll simply display each pony's name. In this example, let's look at declaring and using simple array structures. In our first example, we have an array of strings. It's called Pony_names, and notice in the square brackets, we have subscript values of 0, 1, and 2, so it uses integers. The elements of the array would hold Rainbow Dash, Starlight, and Moondancer, these string literals. Next, we have an array of integers. It's named PonyAges, Again, look at the square brackets. So it uses integers and the subscript value, and they're numbered 0, 1, 2. And the values stored would be 2, 4, and 6. Also, remember that there's that off by 1 issue or fence post issue. Arrays start counting at 0, not at 1. So that's a common logic mistake that we make sometimes. Here we have a for loop, and this is where arrays become very useful and very powerful structures when you combine them with repetition structures, different types of loops. So in our for loop here, we're going to iterate or repeat 3 times, and then what we want to do is simply display pony name and pony age. So we'll do that like that. And if I run it, go ahead and run the script here real quick. Name of pony 1 is Rainbow Dash, age is 2. Pony 2 Starlight, age is 4. Pony 3 is Moon Dancer, and age is 6. There's example 1. Okay, so next we have, in this case, girls team, and that's the name of the array, and here we're using the array method. And we want to create an array with these string values, Ginger, Stacy, Jennifer, and Alicia. So we're going to loop through this, in this case 4 times, because there's 4 girls on the team, 4 elements in the array, girls team, and we're going to display it. Notice how the subscript value works, the square brackets here, and the value of y. Y starts out at 0, it gets postfix incremented through each iteration or repetition of the for loop. So, in other words, team member 0, 1, 2, and 3. That's what would happen here. Next, we're doing something similar with the boys team using the array method, and that's Joe, Al, John, and Jake. Same thing, for loop will iterate through 4 times and display them all using the subscript value and the square brackets. So let's see how that looks. If we run it through the PHP interpreter, just displays all of the members of the girls team and the boys team. Ginger, Stacy, Jennifer, Alicia, Joe, Al, John, Jake. In this next example, we're going to create and use an associative array. And associative arrays use string key value pairs instead of integers for the index or subscript value of the array. So notice here, I have an array of integers, but instead of being indexed as 0, 1, and 2, it's going to be identified by these string values here, Rainbow Dash, Starlight, and Moon Dancer, to store the values 2, 4, and 6. Notice the square brackets and how I index the subscript value here, this time with a string instead of an integer value. Also, I can do the same thing with the array method, although the syntax is a little different. In this case, when I'm building an associative array with the array method for pony age is 2, I need to use the arrow, which is a combination of the equal symbol and the greater than symbol, and then the string would go in double quotes. So Rainbow Dash to hold the value 2, Starlight to hold the value 4, and Moon Dancer to hold the value 6. Again, notice here it's a single quote rather than a double quote, and I'm accessing those from the array name pony ages, Rainbow Dash, Starlight, and Moon Dancer. So let's run it through the PHP interpreter, and you can see how it works. The age of Rainbow Dash is 2, Starlight 4, Moon Dancer 6. In addition to standard arrays, PHP also supports nonsequential arrays. Nonsequential arrays are arrays where there may be gaps between the array's elements. These require special care to avoid accessing null elements in the array. PHP offers several useful methods that work with arrays. Reset sets the current index value of the array to the first element. It takes one argument, which is the name of the array. For example, reset pony names. List returns the value of an object stored in a particular element if it is not null. For example, we can call list and pass in the index or string name of the element and then another variable to store its value. Each iterates through each element in the array passed in as an argument. For example, I can call the method each and pass in the array name. These methods are often used together. For example, let's analyze the following bit of code. We start out with an array that we're going to create called pony names. We'll use the array method, and the very first element, the string Rainbow Dash, will have the default index or subscript value of 0. Now, if we didn't do anything else, Starlight would then be 1 and Moon Dancer 2. But in this example, we're using the arrow or the equals and greater than symbol to artificially change the index or subscript value from the default values. So while Rainbow Dash will be indexed as 0, Starlight will be indexed as 25, and Moon Dancer as 50. If you look, the next line of code we call the reset method, passing in the array's name. So that sets it to the very first element, indexed as 0, Rainbow Dash. Then we have a basic while true loop. and we're going to use the list and the each methods here along with the array. So inside the condition part of the while true loop in the parentheses, look what we're calling the list method. We have two variables there, element and value. Element to represent the element, and then value, the value stored in that element. And the good thing about using the list method is if the object is null, then we don't have to worry about it retrieving a null value. That would be a problem if list didn't take care of it for us. Why? Because remember, Rainbow Dash starts at 0, but then Starlight is 25. So that means elements 1 through 24 are null. Nothing exists there. So it's a good thing that the list method does that for us. And then we call the each method, and that simply takes care of cycling through dynamically however many elements there might be in the array pony names. Then we're just going to create a line of code with the echo function to display an HTML line break, an element, and then after we display the element, the value stored there. Here are some additional array functions. Next iterates to the next element beyond the current element in an array. Example, next pony names. Prev iterates to the previous element before the current element in an array. Example, prev pony names. Current returns the value or object stored in the current element of the array. Now, we'll need in this case a variable to catch the return value that current will spit out when it's done. And then as an argument or parameter, we'll pass in the array's name, which is pony names, to current. Key returns the current index value of the array object passed in. So, for example, here we have a variable index to catch the return value that key will spit out when it's done, and as an argument or parameter, we pass in the array name, pony names. For example, let's analyze the following code. We create an array of integers using the array method, and we name the array pony ages. We then call the reset method to move the index or subscript value to the very first element in the array, indexed as 0 in this example. Next, we have a basic for loop, and we use the count method to dynamically figure out how many objects or elements are stored inside of pony ages. Therefore, in our for loop, it will iterate or repeat the number of elements, in this case 3 times. Next, we have a variable index to catch the return value, and we call the key method passing in the array pony ages. Once we do this, we have another array value, and we call the current method, and again pass in pony ages. So there we have the key, and that's the index or subscript value, and now we have the number or the integer stored at that index or subscript value. Next, we create a line of code with the echo function to basically write out a HTML line break, and we say pony, and then the index value, and then that pony's age, which would be the integer stored at that subscript location. Finally, we call the next method at the bottom, and that moves to the next element in the array. So it will go 0, 1, 2 in our for loop before our for loop is done. In this next example, we're doing something similar, but instead of a while true loop, we're using a do while loop. And notice we create the array with the array method. It's called pony ages. It has 3 elements, and they store the integer values 2, 4, and 3. In the do block, we have our variables index and value, and we call our methods key and current to get the index and the value, and we're simply displaying them. And then notice at the bottom, in the condition portion, where the while is, inside the parentheses, we call the next method to advance to the next element in the array. In this example, we're going to look at several built-in methods that work with arrays in PHP. So notice that we have an array here called pony names 1, and in our array we're using an integer as the subscript value, and it stores strings, Rainbow Dash, Starlight, Moon Dancer. The first method we're going to call is reset, and that has the effect of moving the pointer to the first element in the array, if it were pointing to some other element that wasn't the first one. So after calling reset, there's 2 other functions we're going to use, list and each. List is a unique function. It takes 2 variables, in this case we'll call one element and one value so that they're named for their purpose. Hopefully makes the code easier to follow. But basically, it'll cycle through every single element in the array, and as long as it's not null, if there's an actual value there, it will copy it to this variable here, value. Okay? So very useful inside of a repetition structure or a loop, and we'll see why in just a moment. Now, one of the cool things about this function is if that element is null, if there's nothing stored there, it can handle that, all right? They won't just crash on us or give us some weird unexpected results. So list can deal with null objects, and only if it's not null, there's an actual value there. Would it be copied to this variable called value? Now, list is used in conjunction with each because we want to go through or cycle through every single element in the array. And we want to code it dynamically because we don't necessarily know how many elements are in the array. We don't want a hard-coded value. So sort of like the count method, each will cycle through all of the elements stored inside the array. Very common to use each along with list. And then we're going to simply display, in this case, the element, which would be the subscript value, integers in this case, and the value stored there, which would be the strings in this case. In our next example, we're simply going to invert what we did previously. So in other words, here we used integers as subscript values to hold strings as elements in the array. Well, in Pony names 2, instead of using integers, we're going to use a string key pair to identify the elements, and the values stored in the elements will be integers. Just to show you that we can do the same thing using the same functions, list, each, reset. Again, we call the reset method to cycle the pointer back to the first element in the array. Again, we have the list method and the each method. They do the same thing that they did in the previous example, and here we're going to display the results. Finally, just to show you how it's done, in example 3 here, we have an array Pony names 3, and now we're going to use the array method. And here we're going to basically use the arrow, right, the equals and greater than sign, and we're going to use a key pair here. So notice it's single quotes, not double quotes, but we're going to store the values 2, 4, and 6, and they'll be indexed as rainbow dash, starlight, and moon dancer. So the neat thing about the list method is that it works with all 3 examples. So whether I'm using integers as the subscript value, or whether I'm using a string key pair as the subscript value, or whether I've built the array or created the array utilizing the array method and the arrow, doesn't really matter. This structure here, this data structure, works the same regardless. And that's kind of what we want to examine, or what we want to see. So let's go ahead and run this. And here we can see elements 0, 1, and 2, rainbow dash, starlight, and moon dancer. Now here we have the string key pair element rainbow dash, starlight, moon dancer, and it stores the integers. And then again, notice here elements 2, 4, and 6, rainbow dash, starlight, and moon dancer. Many times arrays have more than one dimension. A common structure is a two-dimensional array. The first dimension could be rows or records, and the second dimension could be columns or fields. Alternatively, the first dimension may be x-coordinates and the second dimension may be y-coordinates. Two-dimensional arrays are useful data structures for many purposes. For example, think of a chessboard. It is 64 squares, 8 rows by 8 columns, and could be represented with a subscript index value like so. An array named chessboard, and then 8 and 8. This says that each row has 8 columns contained within it, and that there are 8 rows. So, if we were going to set up this two-dimensional array in PHP, we'd have to do some nesting. In this case, first we would call the array method, and then inside that call to the array method, and then its parentheses, we would again call the array method multiple times for the rows. So the rows and columns of our chessboard are 64 squares, could be represented by strings. So notice here the first row we have rook, knight, bishop, queen, king, bishop, knight, and rook. And then in the next row we have all pawns. And then in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 rows we simply have spaces. And then we simply invert it when we get to the other side of the chessboard. So if I wanted to access the knight, say at the very top board, it would be index or subscript value 0 for the first row and 1 for, in this case, the second column. Remember that arrays are off by 1. They start counting at 0 instead of counting at 1. So the first column would be indexed as 0, not as 1. The second column would be indexed as 1, not as 2. We could display this two-dimensional array in PHP with the following code. In this case, we're going to generate an HTML table with our PHP, and we're going to display the subscript values of the row in each column, respectively. Notice we start out, we create the table header, then we have a for loop, and basically inside this for loop is another for loop, so it's a nested repetition structure, a nested for loop. So the outer portion of the for loop takes care of printing the rows. And then each row itself has 8 columns, so the inner for loop takes care of printing each column. So if you look, we will iterate for the number of rows, in this case 8, in the outer for loop. And that's where we're going to open our HTML row, and at the very end we'll close our HTML row. And then for that row in the inner for loop, we'll iterate for the number of columns, which again is 8. A good time to pause and analyze this code carefully. Stare at the code and try to get a feel for how a two-dimensional array works and how it is accessed within PHP. In this example, we're going to take a look at multidimensional arrays, specifically two-dimensional arrays. That would be useful for representing something like X and Y coordinates on a game board, or rows and columns in a database table. You could also have three-dimensional arrays. For instance, with a 3D application, you would have to represent the z-axis, so X, Y, Z. And you could even have 4 or more dimension arrays. But we'll stick to just 2 in this example. So let's take a look at our first multidimensional or two-dimensional array, which is Pony details. Notice that we have a nested structure here. So we have the array method, and within its parentheses, notice down here it's the terminating semicolon, we have nested calls to the array method. So effectively what we're doing here is this is row 1, row 2, and row 3. And for each of those rows we have columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, remember that the subscript value with the array starts at 0, not at 1, so there's always that fence poster off by 1 issue. So, the first row would be indexed as 0, and the first column of the first row would also be indexed as 0. So if I wanted to get at this element and retrieve the data stored there, I would access it with a double subscript value. In other words, 2 sets of square brackets, not 1, and it would be 0 and 0. Let's say that I wanted to access this element here. Well, this is the second row, but it's off by 1, so it would be indexed as 1. And this is the third column, but it's off by 1, so it would be indexed as 2. So to get to this element here, it would be 1, 2. Now, when you have a two-dimensional array, a common structure that's used with it would be a repetition structure or some type of a loop. So here we have a for loop. And here's our array. We're going to count up, in this case, the number of rows for Pony details. So 1, 2, and 3. We'll iterate or repeat in that loop 3 times. We'll postfix increment x. So there's our update activity there. And we're going to display. In this case, for the first row, we'll start out, x is 0. So that's this first row here. We're going to go 0, 1, 2, 3 to display all the columns. So notice this second set of subscript values here is 0, 1, 2, 3. That'll display all the data members, okay? Then x gets incremented, so that means it moves on from the first row, indexed as 0, to the second row, indexed as 1. And same thing, 0, 1, 2, 3 will display all the columns. Then x is incremented again, which moves us to the third row, which is indexed as 2. And again, we'll display all 4 columns of data. So you'll be able to see how that works when we run it through the interpreter. This next example is also a multidimensional or two-dimensional array, and it represents a chessboard. Again, notice the nested array structure, or the way that we're using the array method. So we have this outer call to the array method, and then within the parentheses, we have inner nested calls to the array method. And so basically the structure is row, 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 8 rows. And for each of those rows, you have column, 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 8 columns. So 64 squares. Could be a good game board for, say, checkers or chess. Now, with two-dimensional arrays, a common structure is not just a loop, a repetition structure, but a nested loop structure, especially with databases. Why? Because you can quickly cycle through all of the elements in a two-dimensional array and split it into rows and columns if you nest a repetition structure. So we have 2 nested for loops here, an outer for loop and an inner for loop. The outer for loop takes care of cycling through the rows. All right, so row starts out at 0. We're going to postfix increment it and cycle through as long as rows is less than 8. So it'll just count up starting at the subscript value of 0, which is the first row, all the way down to the subscript value of 7, which is the last row. So that's what that outer for loop is doing. Now for each of those rows, there are 8 columns. And so the inner for loop is going to cycle or iterate 8 times for every single repetition of the outer for loop. So again, for each row, 8 columns. Next row, 8 columns. Next row, 8 columns, and so forth. And finally, we're going to display the value of what's stored there, be it empty space, be it a pawn, rook, knight, bishop, queen, king, whatever. To do that, we use the echo function. And again, notice the double subscript value since it's a two-dimensional array. So instead of only having one set of square brackets, we have 2 to represent rows and columns. Okay? So let's run it and see how that looks. And again, notice we're going through row 1, all the columns, row 2, all the columns, row 3, all the columns. And here is our chessboard. Again, row, column, 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 next row, column, 8 columns, next row, 8 columns, next row, 8 columns, and so forth, all the way to the end. Again, if you need to, pause the video to further examine the code and the output, please do. You want to make sure that you have a pretty good understanding of how two-dimensional arrays work. PHP offers a plethora of array sorting methods. Let's look at a few. Sort sorts first by numeric and then by alphabetical order. A sort sorts in alphabetical order without changing the indexes. rsort sorts in reverse order. arsort sorts in reverse order without changing indexes. ksort sorts by key values. krsort sorts by key values in reverse order. usort is sorting with customized functions. uasort is customizable sorting with string indexes. And uksort is a customizable sort by keys. Look at the following bit of code. Here we have an array called inventory, and it holds string values, master sword, claw shot, bomb bag, digger mitts, goddess bow, beetle, and absurdly sturdy shield. Now the first for loop uses the count method to cycle through each element in the array and display it as is. But next we call the sort method when passing the array name inventory. So when we do this, it will resort or reorder the elements alphabetically. So the next time we call the for loop, instead of being displayed as master sword, claw shot, bomb bag, all of the items will be listed in alphabetical order, starting with absurdly sturdy shield. Note, a limitation of sort and rsort is that if you have assigned string indexes to elements in an array, those string indexes will be lost after the sort. To keep string indexes after a sort, use asort or arsort. Here are some examples using additional built-in array methods in PHP, like next, prev, current, and key. So if we look at example 1, again we're building an array called PonyAges1 that will store 3 integers using the array method. Now we'll cycle the pointer back to the first element in the array by calling the reset function. We're going to use the count method to dynamically cycle through each element in the array and loop or iterate the appropriate number of times. We're going to use key and current. Key will give us the index value and we'll store it in this variable here, and current will give us the value that's stored there, in this case the integer, and that'll store it here. So as we cycle through the loop, basically we're going to get 0, 1, 2, and for 0 we'll display 2, for 1 we'll display 4, and for 2 we'll display 3. And we're going to use next here, and that will move the pointer on to the next element in the array. So if we do this, we could also code this using x here, and just use x as a subscript value on the array, but this is a way to do it with these built-in functions or methods in PHP. If you look at the next example, we're building another array, PonyAges2, with the array method. We reset the pointer back to the first element in the array. Here we're using key and current to retrieve the subscript value and the value of what's stored in the element there once we have the subscript value. And then next to cycle through, but this is a do while loop, so it's just a bit of a different repetition structure. And if we run this example, let's see how it looks through the interpreter. Look at this code here. We're doing something similar to what we did before. We're creating an array called inventory. However, this time instead of using the default integer subscript value for the elements of the array, we're using a string key pair, weapon 1, weapon 2, weapon 3. So we're going to generate a while true loop and iterate through each element in the array using the list and each method. Then we're going to call asort in this example, on the inventory array. Then in our second while true loop, once again we're going to iterate through each element in the array. And this way we won't lose the string value pairs that go with each element. Here's an example of using the ksort method to sort by key values. For our fourth example, we're going to use the customizable sort method usort. Remember, you can create your own sorting methods and use them with a built-in PHP array method known as usort. For example, say we define the following method, string length, which is simply going to determine whether string 1 is longer than string 2. We can now make use of our custom function defined previously with the usort method. So if you look here, we have our array, we have our two while true loops as we did before, but this time we're calling usort. We pass in the array and then the name of the function that we define, string length. Here we have some examples of array sorting methods. So the very first one we're going to look at is the sort method. And it'll sort things numerically and then alphabetically. So we have an array that we built of strings here, and they're not in any particular order. Master sword, claw shot, absurdly sturdy shield is at the very end, and if that were to be sorted alphabetically, it should be at the beginning. So we want to sort it, or let's reorder the elements stored in this array. So to do that, we'll use the sort method. So we're going to go through before the sort and display all of the elements one by one. And again, that'll let us see in the output that they're in no particular alphabetical order. Here we're going to call the sort method on our array. And that's going to take care of reordering everything alphabetically. And then we have another for loop, and we're going to basically cycle through all the elements again. And that'll show you the effect after the sort. In this case, because we called sort, they should all be rearranged alphabetically. In other words, absurdly sturdy shield would be first. So let's look at how the first example looks when we run it through the interpreter. All right, so displaying the array before sort, again, notice they're in no particular alphabetical order. But after we call the sort method, notice that they've all been alphabetized and listed accordingly. The next function we're going to look at is asort, okay? And that would allow us to basically rearrange or sort things alphabetically, but without losing the key values. If I were to do this with sort, it wouldn't be a syntax error, but I would lose the key values in the rearranging process. All right, so if I don't want to do that, in other words, I want a key value pair so that master sort is referenced as weapon 1 and bomb bag is weapon 2 and so forth. If I don't want those to be reordered, then I would need to use asort rather than sort. And so again, we're going to plug all of these into a while true loop so we can see what they are before the sort. We're going to call it asort, and then we're going to show how they all look after the sort. So let's run it through the interpreter. And if we look at example 2 before asort, notice that weapon 1, weapon 2, weapon 3 is master sword, bomb bag, and goddess bow. And again, let me display the code for that. Weapon 1, master sword, weapon 2, bomb bag, weapon 3, goddess bow, okay? After calling asort on it, notice that in this case we have sorted things alphabetically, so bomb bag, goddess bow, master sword. But we didn't want the key string pairs to be rearranged. So in order for it to retain that key string relationship, we needed to use asort instead of sort. And so notice weapon 2, weapon 3, weapon 1, they still maintain the same relationship that they had in the original code before the sort. Next, we're going to look at ksort, okay? And for ksort here, again, notice we have string key value pairs, and notice how things are set up here. In this case, claw shot, beetle, laser whip, nothing's in any particular alphabetical order. All right, we have a while true loop. We're going to display how everything looks before we call ksort. Then we're going to go call ksort, and then we're going to plug everything back into a while true loop to show the results. How does everything look after we call ksort? All right, so let's take a look at example 3 through the interpreter. Right here, example 3. Display an array before ksort. So again, watch. Weapon 2, weapon 3, weapon 1 would be claw shot and beetle and laser whip. Now after K-sort, notice that it's sorted alphabetically in reverse order. So laser whip, claw shot, and beetle. Okay, in no particular order here, or it was alphabetically ordered, excuse me, but here it's reversed, all right? So we've done the reverse alphabetical sort, and notice the key value pairs here. Next, we're going to look at uSort, which is a customizable sort function. And we talked about this a little bit a while ago previously. We created our own function called string length, which is simply going to return which is the longer of two strings using the string length function. And just to show you that, when we use uSort, we can customize or write our own functions to be used in the sorting process. And that's a pretty powerful, very useful feature in PHP. And so we can couple uSort with any of these custom functions that we've written. So for the example here, a function to determine between two strings which is the longer string. Okay, we have an array here called inventory4, and its key string value pairs. We have master sword, bomb bag, and goddess bow. Okay, before we do anything, we're going to plug it into a while true loop and display all the elements. Now we're going to go call uSort. We're going to pass in our array as the first argument or parameter, and then our function, our custom function, is going to be passed in as the second argument. Now, notice the syntax here. All right, we're not using the parentheses or the argument list. We're just using the name and the function signature, or the function definition. All right, so that's sort of unusual, but you want to take note of that when you're passing that into uSort. No parentheses here, no arguments. Also notice instead of double quotes that there are single quotes around the function name. All right, so again, function name inside single quotes function name. And so what's going to happen is uSort is then going to rearrange everything in the array inventory4 according to the results of string length. So basically, it'll return the weapon that has the greatest number of characters, the longest string, down to the shortest string after uSort. And once we do that, we'll plug it into a while true loop and display the results. All right, so let's go look at the results of example 4. And again, we'll run it through the interpreter. We scroll down here to the bottom. You look at example 4. So before uSort, again, not in any particular order. Notice that we have master sword, which is longer, bomb bags in the middle, which is shorter, and goddess bow. Now after uSort, notice here's the shortest string, the next longest string, and the next longest string.